My grandmother was Chiricahua Apache, and that is a culture that has been passed down from my mother to me, and I pass down a lot of the culture to my children.
Okay. Do you know any stories about how your family came to the United States and where did they settle?
My grandmother was born in the Sierra Madre in Mexico. Um, she came to the United States back in late 1800s, early 1900s. Um, Her family was exterminated by the Yaqui Indians. They were hired by the U.S. government to um, basically wipe out the Chiricahua Apaches. My my grandmother watched as her whole family was killed in front of her, and her mother had put her in a basket and told her not to make any noise, which is some of the training that Apaches teach their children. She made no noise, but she watched her family die, and there was one woman who had cuts all over her body, but she survived, and she found my grandmother, who was about 4 years old, and she took my grandmother from there. She traveled to Nogales, Arizona, and that's how my grandmother came to the United States.
Okay. What stories have came to you about your parents and grandparents and distant ancestors?
Well, my grandmother talked a lot about her distant ancestors, her mother, and she had seven sisters, six sisters. She was the seventh daughter of seven daughters. Um, she always told me that her uncle was Geronimo, who came to be known as Geronimo, but his real name was Goyocle. And my grandmother was very, very proud of that ancestor, very proud of who she was. She met my grandfather, who came from Dublin, Ireland, in Nogales. She was about 14 years old and he was about 45, but he fell in love with her. And she didn't speak any English and he didn't speak her language, but they managed to have 12 children, 9 of whom lived. And that's one of the stories that we talk a lot about in our family. And my mother, when I was young and she told me that story, I said, Mom, how could they have 12 children if they didn't speak the same language? And my mother said, oh, there's other languages you can speak when you love each other. My mother was the next to the youngest of the kids, and she only weighed about a pound and a half when she was born. She was a preemie, and my grandmother was used to having very big children, and she saw my mother and it scared her so bad she threw her up in the air, and my mother landed on the corner of the bed, and and they kept her in a shoebox at first with hot bricks around her in a drawer, and then she grew, but she was always very, very tiny. My mother was always very much tinier than the other kids.
Okay, this one's kind of similar, but any courtship stories? How did other family members come to marry? So, how did they end up getting married?
Well, my family was kind of interesting because there were no extended family on my mother's side. But there are lots of romantic stories in my family. My mom grew up, she was born in the 30s, and so, through World War II and in the 50s, she met my father. She was working as a telephone operator in Nogales, and my father was a lineman, and he used to call her all the time, and she would flirt with him over the phone, and she said he looked just like Marlon Brando, and she always called him Marlon Brando. And so he kept saying he wanted to go out with her, and she wouldn't go out with him. So one night he came to the office, to the place where she worked, and as she was getting off work, she opened the door to the office, and he opened his door to his car, and so she had to get into his car.
Aww.
And so that's kind of how they met, and they started dating, and they ended up getting married.
Okay. What special food food traditions does your family have?
Well, we have a number of them, some of which, my kids like, and some of them they think is gross. Um, One of our big things is tamales. I love to make green corn tamales, but you can make them with ground corn, and it's interesting. My grandmother used to literally grind the corn with a matate. But now we're so lazy, and we used to use lard. Lard was a big thing in tamales, but now I'm so health conscious. I use oil, like olive oil, and now I get my uh, masarena is what you make the tamales out of, and I get that at the store, and it's already kind of pre-mixed.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember my mother making the masa and mixing in the lard, and you had to mix it. She'd make these great big things because we'd make 60 dozen
Mm-hmm.
tamales, and we always started making them in November because that's the food you ate all the way through into the new year.
Hmm.
But so that's one of the foods. Another food is menudo, which is beef tripe and hominy soup. And I love it, but none of my kids will eat it or even consider it. And my husband says he's eaten it once, and that's good enough for him. But I love menudo. It's beef tripe and hominy and garlic and onion, and it's very delicious.
Okay.
Tortillas were always big, and beans, lots
Okay.
of beans.
Were there certain foods traditionally prepared for the holidays,
Yes.
and who made them?
Okay, my mother and my sisters and I, and my grandmother, until she got too old to do it. But it's traditionally a family thing where the mother and the daughters are making it, and also female friends that would come over. And it was one of those traditions that I always loved. We started in November when it would cool down there. And you would make this masa, and you'd all sit around rolling the masa talking about the men. That was the best thing. And so even now, when I make my green corn tamales, it's all women. And we all sit around and we roll those tamales and talk about the men.
That's funny.
And then for New Year's, there were two foods, buñuelos, which is a fry bread, and also menudo. And the menudo, my father would cook, and he would cook it all day from the fresh hominy, not the stuff you get in cans, but the fresh hominy. And it cooked all day over a wood fire.
Okay.
And so you ate it as soon as the clock struck midnight, and you ate
Wow.
the buñuelos.
That's interesting. Which family keepsakes do you possess, and why?
I have a couple of things. My grandmother had a pair of earrings that were gold, and they're in the shape of an Apache medicine cross, and they have little flattened stones that come down from the corners, which is an Apache medicine cross. That's what
Oh.
it looks like. So I have that she gave me. And then I have my grandmother's ring that she gave me. She had a gold and pearl ring. And my mother passed that down to me. And that's very precious to me.
Okay. Do you speak any other languages? And if so, what language?
I speak Spanish.
Okay. Any expressions or jokes that your family use, and can you give an example of one?
One of the expressions that all families out there use is hijuela, which I don't know that there is really any kind of a real definition, but hijuela means oh my gosh, and you're not going to find that in any textbook. But hijuela is one of those.
Okay.
And also, my mother always said "God love it,"
Mm-hmm.
which was "God love it," but it was always "God love it," and so those are two. That
Okay.
kind of.
And then last question is, how are holidays celebrated, and what are most important? Which ones are the most important holidays?
Well, in our culture, it was always the Christmas holiday was the most important, and it started really a month before the holidays. You had Advent, but we out west there's something called La Posada, which is it's a procession that goes on different nights of the week before Christmas from house to house to house, like the journey of Mary when she was looking for a place to stay
Mm-hmm.
to give birth. And so it's from house to house, and at each house, you know, different people take it on different nights, but each house you have refreshments and there's songs and there's celebrations and those kinds of things.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for doing this
You're welcome.
interview. Thank
You're
you.
welcome.